Hello, welcome to LightMeter, a podcast discussing the ideas and theories behind why pictures are the way they are. We won't be talking about gear that much, only when it's pertinent to our subject at hand. So if that's what you're looking for, you may want to go somewhere else. If you're still with me and you're still interested, welcome. I'm your host, Robert Schultze. In this first episode, I'm going to talk about my story, my career, and how I got here. What's important to me in photography, in life, and all that stuff. I'm a photographer working in California in the advertising editorial realm. I've worked with a diverse set of clients from local magazines and organizations to some national campaigns, and I've even spent some time in the fine art world. I started out in a very remote Midwestern farm town about 20 years ago when I was given a little 35mm Vivitar fixed focal length point and shoot camera. Yeah, that's right, film. I would set up my action figures and take pictures of them in all kinds of poses, usually scenarios from Indiana Jones, Star Wars, high-action car chases, explosions, and fights with the bad guys. At first, I was always disappointed when I got my film back because pictures never really turned out how I imagined them in my head. I was always interested in art growing up and pursued things like drawing, painting, and writing, so I gave photography a rest and tried out other mediums. I took painting classes and writing courses and would constantly spend time in offices looking at art on the walls. I kept constantly circling back to photography, however, and with each failed picture, I would figure out something new about lighting or exposure with photography and get one step closer to capturing what was in my head. And then digital happened. Digital was already happening at the time, but it was not on my radar and it was very expensive. Film was still the king mostly. But I was fascinated by what could be done with digital and Photoshop, and I was starting to get a handle on lighting. And I could see my pictures right away instead of having to bug my mom to bring my film to the Oscar drug in town, wait a week, only to have to bug her again to pick up my prints and negatives. Most importantly though, with digital, I could finally make the images that I saw in my head. I started to work up the courage to bring prints into local cafes and coffee shops in town, and even sold some of my work to people at my job as a lifeguard at the YMCA. At the time, I was photographing landscapes and close-ups and soft focus things like fine art stuff. I even sold a few images to a local newspaper and got published in their snapshot section. I started to think of ways I could actually make money, and all signs pointed to two things: weddings and senior photos. Most photographers that had any sort of success in the Midwest did weddings. In my mind, this is how you made it in photography. I covered a few friends' weddings and did portraits for my family and some acquaintances. And at first I really liked it. I was getting a much higher than average wage for a 16-year-old in Wisconsin, charging $35 per hour for the day of shooting, and I would edit for free because I liked doing that stuff. Yeah, don't worry, I learned my lesson real quick. Typically, after a week or two, I would meet with the clients and go through the images with them. They would make their selections and order prints through me, which I would get from the local Osco drug and mark them up a few bucks to make a nice little profit. My dad, who was a teacher turned auto mechanic, didn't really understand why I was interested in art. He wanted what any parent would want for their kid: a stable job to lead to a good life. But he encouraged me nonetheless by giving me magazines and clippings from Time or National Geographic. At the time, these weren't really the types of images that I was interested in or even capable of making, but to him, it was the height of the medium. During this time, I was also trying to get into a local gallery in town called the Art Garage, a place that showed the work of all the movers and shakers in the local art scene. It just seemed so cool, with long winding hallways around the edge of the space and the easels and used paintbrushes and artist studios in the middle. I was getting to know the artists, and while there were only a few photographers, the sculptors, painters, and musicians provided an eclectic community for me to develop as an aspiring artist. One of the most well-known was an artist named Jack. He was a bit eccentric, but he was at every event, every opening, and every open mic playing his guitar. He created these beautiful, intricate line drawings that had a real sense of movement and flow. His background was fascinating too. Supposedly, he had spent many years homeless and dealing with schizophrenia, and his only solace came when he would literally tear up his own bed sheets to create canvases to paint on. And his music would tie into his drawings as well, creating an interconnecting web that would paint a picture of a man that was deeply sensitive, observant, and sharp as a tack. So it was a fairly small, tightly knit community at the Art Garage, and between open mics, local cafes and bars, art walks twice a month, and a few dedicated art openings, it began to thrive and grow into the perfect environment for a young and upcoming artist. I had a wall there for a few months where I displayed some of my pieces, and then after a few openings and events, I had my eyes set on displaying in other venues. The Art Garage was still a fairly niche concept in an industrial city, and I wanted to hang my work where everyone would see it. Eventually, I had shows and pieces displayed in nearly every venue in town, and in a few other cities as well. Galleries, libraries, cafes, bars. I had a solo show when I was 18 in a small gallery that hosted artists for a month at a time, and I had it packed every weekend with live music and drinks. I was still shooting weddings and portraits, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for me. I wanted to capture exciting things people had never seen. I wanted to work in a studio and take pictures like the ones I saw in magazines. I had been looking at colleges mostly close to home and mostly for design. When my older sister started seeing an overzealous programmer who was looking to head to California, I started looking at schools there because that way we would both have family on the other side of the country to rely on. I settled on the Academy of Art University in San Francisco, and after applying and sending in a portfolio, which I am now extremely embarrassed of, I got in and was set to start classes in the next year. While I was out there, I went through a number of changes as an artist, as a person. I went from shooting primarily still life to primarily portraiture. I got to process my own film and learn about the chemistry of the darkroom. I made friends that I'm sure you'll hear on this podcast at some point. I had the pleasure of assisting many talented photographers and work in various aspects of the industry. I got my first magazine job. I got to travel for work. I won awards. I was fortunate enough to get paid for the thing that I loved to do, all while still in school. I was occasionally shooting for small publications and independent zines, that is, magazines that were printed on copy paper and distributed by mail or word of mouth, with card tables at galleries and a tenderloin right next to the punk rock band that was playing that night. A lot of times, I was even shooting bands. I dabbled a bit in concert photography back in Wisconsin and had the opportunity to cover some local bands in San Francisco, even a handful of my favorite bigger acts. I started out working with what is now one of the most well-known event photography companies in the city as a photo editor. I would receive hundreds and sometimes thousands of images per night that were meant to be edited and processed by the next morning to go to print in magazines, newspapers, and websites. It was a good job for a college student. It never got in the way of my classes, it was at night, and it was in the world of photography, and it paid pretty good, so it was perfect. It was also very stressful. Tight deadlines, unpredictable schedule, exasperating boss. I knew it was just a rung on the ladder of my career. I also spent a lot of time assisting Bay Area photographers working on magazine and advertising shoots. I very regularly worked with Aubrey Pick on fashion, still life, and food shoots, Claudine Gosset on portrait and event photography, Misha Brook for architectural shoots, and Mel Lindstrom for advertising and editorial. In 2011, a little social and political event happened called the Occupy Wall Street movement. There were massive protests and marches on Market Street nearly every day, and on a whim, I managed to cater a school assignment to photograph portraits of the people at these protests. I imagined these portraits to be like the stark black and white images of Richard Avedon, with clean white backdrops to emphasize the unique qualities and traits of these characters. I aced the assignment and sent a few of the portraits around to see if I could get them shown anywhere. Honestly, I didn't think anything else of it. Within a few days, I had phone calls, messages, and emails from nearly every newspaper, magazine, and even TV networks in the city. I spoke to a professor who was and still is a working photojournalist about my various offers, and we narrowed it down to who to sell the publication rights to. After that, I suddenly had something that most kids from the Midwest never even dreamed of: notoriety. I was interviewed in magazines. I was on TV. I was exhibiting with art galleries and museums. I started traveling all over the country to make more of these Occupy Wall Street portraits. I created a GoFundMe campaign to help support my travel and easily exceeded my goal. After all was said and done, I had traveled to nearly every major city on the West Coast, several cities on the East Coast, and several more in between. I was starting to get a taste of what the real working world of photography would be like. In my senior year in college, I took a class called editorial photography, which is what I was primarily interested in. This was taught by a tough and currently working photographer named Karen Alpert. She would give us very specific assignments that were straight from assignments that she had in the past, and she was a tough critic. She actually made some of my classmates cry. Sometimes the assignments were very challenging, which made it all the more satisfying when she was impressed with your work. She took the class, those that were able to afford it, to New York City for 1 week, where we went to meet with various photographers, creative directors, and media companies. We ate thin crust pizza and attended glamorous events and parties. At the end of a long day of portfolio reviews, meetings with art directors and photographers, I would sleep on the floor of an acquaintance dorm room because even the hostels in New York City were expensive at the time. I was really starting to understand the gravity of being a working photographer in a big city, and I gotta be honest, it really excited me. When I graduated in 2013, I was already freelancing regularly for magazines, websites, and PR agencies. So it was a fairly easy transition to working life. I just have more time now. I got to work with a variety of clients in the Bay Area to capture unique portraits of CEOs, boutique shop owners, and some celebrities. In late 2015, I had a solo exhibition of some work I did in a little gallery in Tenderloin, my first show in California. The zines we made for it nearly sold out, and we were packed all weekend. In early 2016, I was wanting to have a taste of stability and started working with GoPro in their advanced media department. Sort of like a camera rental department that also tested new products and their durability by dropping them off rooftops, crashing them into walls, and drowning them in lakes. It was a fun job. To this day, I still keep in touch with nearly everyone from that department. From there, I had a stint as a photography producer at a large clothing brand, coordinating photo shoots and managing image libraries. Today, I work with my partner at a fabulous dance and photography studio in the Bay Area. I shoot for magazines, some local organizations, and do the occasional headshot or portrait. Lately, I've been really into building sets. But also, I've been thinking a lot about my place in photography, what stands out to me when I look at the work of the artists, photographers, or otherwise. That's what this podcast is going to be all about. Discussing the works of other artists, personal anecdotes about my time in the industry, and the investigation of concepts in the medium. Thanks for listening. I'm Robert Schultze, and this has been LightMeter. LightMeter is researched, hosted, and produced by me, Robert Schultze. It's also co-produced by Lauren Baines and recorded in San Jose, California. Did you enjoy this podcast? Let me know your thoughts and send an email to lightmeterpodcast@gmail.com. You can listen to us on anchor.com/lightmeter, and I'm on Facebook at LightMeter Podcast, Twitter at LightMeterPC, YouTube at LightMeter. I know, sorry, there's a lot of variation on the name, but if you search for LightMeter and see our podcast logo, that's the one. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.